What is up, you guys? I'm Charmx today, and we're reacting to This Was the Day the World Almost Ended by RealLifeLore. Now, RealLifeLore makes really cool videos. Apparently, the world almost ended someday. And judging from this title, this is going to be a very interesting video. And probably quite terrifying video as well. But yeah, with that being said, the original link's in the description. Without any further ado, let's begin.
October 27th, 1962.
1962, that's a long time ago.
Is the most important date in human history that nobody really knows about. It was the day that human civilization came the closest that it's ever been to being totally annihilated.
Oh, I think I know where this is going. I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to continue on. I don't know if it's exactly what I'm thinking it is, but I think I might know.
If events had gone slightly differently that day, or one man had made a different decision, it's very likely
Oh, I definitely know where this is going.
that you would never have existed in the first place. And even if you did, the world you know today in 2019 would more closely resemble Fallout than our own. Because on October 27th, 1962, the world came the closest it's ever been to full-out nuclear war.
Oh yeah, I know this. I know this. Basically, what I think this story is about is, at one point, I don't know which country, whether it's Russia or the US, but like their warning detection system went off saying that there was a nuclear strike incoming, and the person made the decision that the alarm was actually just an accident and not actually a missile strike incoming, and so that decision there basically saved the world from a nuclear war. Because if the person thought it actually was a nuclear strike, then would have been retaliation, and then you get a nuclear war after that.
Circumstances that almost led to disaster began 3 years previously in 1959, when the previous government of Cuba was overthrown by a new Marxist Communist Party that became the first country in the Western Hemisphere to openly ally with the Soviet Union. A communist country just 90 miles away from Florida was unacceptable to the US government at the time, and multiple attempts by the American government to assassinate Castro or overthrow his government, like the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, all failed. The American-sponsored but half-hearted invasion at the Bay of Pigs convinced Castro that the Americans were going to try and launch a full-scale
Maybe this is not what I was thinking. This does not seem to be the story at least I was thinking of.
Invasion of Cuba at some point in the future. And so Castro was getting closer and closer in his alliance with the USSR. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was concerned not only with the possibility of an American invasion of Cuba, but also with the recent deployments of American nuclear missiles in Italy, and more alarmingly to them, in Turkey. The missiles here were within striking distance of Ukraine and southern Russia itself, and America possessed
Or maybe it is the one I'm thinking of.
170 ICBMs on the American mainland capable of striking anywhere inside of the USSR. The Soviets, at the same time, only possessed a few dozen ICBMs. And besides that, they had no possible ability to strike the US mainland itself. The solution to balance out this disparity in attack capability in the eyes of the Soviets was obvious. They had thousands of
What, friggin' move their weapons closer to the US? Oh, move them to Cuba. There we go, move them to Cuba. I don't know, is that actually what happened? I'm taking a guess.
medium and short-range nuclear missiles that couldn't hit the US from anywhere inside of the Soviet Union. So, why not begin putting these missiles in the territory
They did, oh my goodness.
of their new allies in Cuba that could then threaten to strike pretty much anywhere inside of America, just like the Americans had done by placing their missiles in Turkey. The problem was, the Soviets weren't sure how the Americans would react to nuclear missiles 90 miles away from their coast, so they began moving them in absolute secrecy starting in September 1962. It was the start of the most dangerous gamble that humanity has ever played,
That's crazy, I wasn't aware of this.
with the entire fate of the world literally at stake.
Or at least if I was aware, I totally forgot.
And for the first time in America's history, she faced the same threat that nearly every other country in the world has faced for centuries. The very real threat of total annihilation by an external power. The first photographic evidence of Soviet missiles by American spy planes flying over Cuba was acquired on October 14th. President Kennedy was notified on October 16th, when he called a meeting to discuss the American response options. They included doing nothing, using diplomacy
Doing nothing? Well, yeah, that is a response.
Sea to pressure the Soviets to withdraw, threatening Castro with an invasion, blockading Cuba to prevent any new missiles from arriving, using airstrikes to destroy the known missile site locations, or using the US military to launch a full-scale invasion of Cuba to destroy the missile sites and overthrow Castro and his regime. The American Joint Chiefs of
Which one did they decide to do? Because my history ain't that good.
Staff were unanimous in their approval of the invasion option.
Oh, the invasion option. Well, there you go. There you go.
But only Kennedy disagreed. Unknown to them, Castro himself was convinced that America was planning on invading and urged the Soviets to fire a preemptive nuclear strike on
Oh my goodness.
American cities in preparation for it. The Soviet leader Khrushchev hesitated on his side, while Kennedy hesitated on his own side. Imagine how different the course of events may have been with any other world leaders who might have more easily fallen into peer pressure. But neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev did, although both prepared for war. Kennedy authorized a limited blockade of Cuba on October 22nd that was stopping.
This is actually really interesting to me because I'm not the biggest history buff and I know very little in history. So this is all kind of new information, or if it's like if I learned it in school, I don't remember it.
Any ship traveling suspected of carrying weapons. Khrushchev announced that the Soviets would be ignoring this blockade, and for the first time in US history, the nuclear alert system was raised to DEFCON 2, just one step before all-out nuclear war would be declared. And for the only time in US history, nuclear bombers went on continuous 24-hour alert, with several orbiting the USSR itself.
Wow, that's wild.
Ready to drop the nukes on a 15-minute notice. 145 American ICBMs were armed and made ready to launch, with several aimed directly at Cuba. On October 20th,
145. Yeah, could you imagine if like all of those went off? Earth would almost be like uninhabitable at that point. Like the amount of radiation and stuff that would be in the air. Oh, it'd be horrible.
5th, the Soviets began challenging the US blockade and even getting a few ships slipped past. On October 26th, the US began making full preparations to invade Cuba, while on the same day, Castro continued to urge the Soviets in a telegram to launch the nuclear first strike against America. And then, finally, in this atmosphere of extreme...
How did all this like calm down? Because this is like crazy intense, right? How did all this calm down?
Tension. The day of October 27th came that decided the fate of the entire world right up until our current time. A Soviet submarine flotilla had managed to slip past the blockade of Cuba undetected sometime previously. But on October 27th, one of these subs, B-59, was discovered by the Americans. A squad of 11 American destroyers and one aircraft carrier pursued the Soviet sub and
11 just for what?
Dived further underwater. In order to signal they wanted the submarine to resurface and positively identify itself as a part of the blockade, one of the American destroyers began dropping practice dummy depth charges on B-59. These couldn't possibly hurt the submarine because they were just dummies.
So they tricked it to coming up?
But the Soviet crew on board didn't know that. They assumed that the charges were real, and since they had lost contact with Moscow several days previously, most of them assumed that war may have already started back above the surface.
I don't blame them. You don't have communication and you're in like a very tense situation like this.
Their submarine was armed with a T-5 torpedo tipped with a 5-kiloton nuclear warhead. If war had truly begun back above the surface like they believed, and the nukes had already been fired, then it wouldn't matter if they fired their nuclear torpedo against the American ships that seemed to be attacking them. There were 3 officers on board that all had to agree on deploying a nuclear weapon, and while 2 of them did agree, the third, named Vasily Arkhipov, was the sole man who disagreed. Arkhipov was the commander of the whole Soviet submarine.
Maybe this is the story I'm familiar with, but I was just not aware to the detail of the story.
Flotilla, and he just happened to choose by chance to be aboard B-59. Usually, the deployment of a nuclear weapon on a Soviet submarine only required the authorization of the 2 most senior ranking commanders on board, the captain and the political officer. Had Arkhipov not been present, these 2 who were in favor of the nuclear option would have had their way and it would have been fired.
And then it would have been a war.
The presence of Arkhipov on board by mere chance meant that his approval was also required though, and he stood alone and disagreed against the peer pressure of his fellow officers. Eventually they relented, and desperate for air after being underwater for so long, they resurfaced and returned back to the Soviet.
How long is so long? I mean, back in 1962, I don't know how the capabilities of the submarines, but like nowadays, I think there are some submarines that can go underwater, like, legit for a month. I was watching something recently and I heard that. I'm like, that's kind of crazy. You go underwater for a month?
Soviet Union. But had things gone differently, if Arkhipov made a different
I think this must have been the story I was thinking of. Or it has to have been. But then again, I don't know. I know it might be or it might just be something similar to what I was thinking of.
decision, whether he fell into peer pressure or if he simply chose a different submarine to be present on, you probably wouldn't exist, and neither would the internet or probably anything else that you know. That 5-kiloton torpedo was about 1/3 the power of the Hiroshima bomb, and it probably would have destroyed most of that American naval squadron, killing thousands of American sailors and destroying a dozen ships, including an aircraft carrier. Under the tense atmosphere that was already present, it's believable to assume that the Americans would have responded by launching a nuclear strike of their own against Cuba and maybe even the USSR.
Yeah, it's called retaliation. You know, you get a whole bunch of your guys nuked. Not hard to believe there would be some retaliation involved, you know? Kind of reminds me of playing Civ 5 or 6. I think that's a new one. That's one I got recently and I was playing it. And in it, like, I was trying to take over the world. So I'd taken over a big continent and I was going after another big continent. And so I had submarines everywhere with nukes. And I launched like, I don't know, it must have been like 30 nukes on this continent, and the whole thing was just wiped. And yeah, it's basically uninhabitable at that point with the amount of radiation.
Leading down the path to apocalypse and an early real-life version of Fallout.
That was crazy. Do they teach this in school? Because I don't particularly remember that ago. It was a while I was in high school. But I don't particularly remember them teaching this, but they might have, I don't know. But that's really cool. Like, I was not aware of this. But as I said, you know, I had heard a story of something similar to this, where they thought they were getting nuked, and they decided not to, you know, retaliate. Now, I don't know if that was the situation or if it was a different one. But yeah, nonetheless, this was really cool. I enjoyed this video a lot. I hope you guys did as well. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up if you're new, and subscribe to join the family. Also, make sure you guys go subscribe to RealLifeLore. That link's in the description. And yeah, with that being said, I'll see you guys next time. Boop.